Thank you to everyone joining us today from around the country and the world. I'm Alexander McCobin, CEO here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc., and just so appreciate you taking the time to learn and grow in community with us today. We're joined in this virtual gathering by Eric Ries to explore long-termism and the lasting strategies that work for business leaders who think big. Now, as many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of capitalism in business. It's a movement of business leaders around the world working to change the practice and perception of capitalism to elevate humanity. And Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement. Every week, we offer virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and best practices of those in our network. Now, today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. Eric and I are going to be in conversation for about the first 30, but then transition to questions from you during the last 15 minutes of the session. So if at any point you have any questions that you want to ask, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, because I'm going to be monitoring that as we go through this. And if there's a question that ties in with what we're talking about, I can bring it up at any point, and we're going to get to as many of your questions as we can. And if you have any technical questions or issues, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org so we can address them right away. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Eric is the founder and CEO of the Long-Term Stock Exchange. Before that, he created the Lean Startup methodology and is author of The Lean Startup and the Startup Way. Eric founded IMVU and served as an entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Business School, IDEO, and Pivotal, and has been a tremendous thought leader in the business world for a long time, a tremendous entrepreneur and leader. And it is just such an exciting time for us to get to talk about what's going on at the Long-Term Stock Exchange. Eric, thank you for taking the time to speak with us in the community. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really looking forward to it.
So I want to start by just going through your background and getting a sense of what your journey has been like over the years. So I'm wondering if you could just share what your story is that's gotten you to where you are today.
I don't know what's that saying that to describe the cause of any event, you have to go back to the creation of the universe and every event that happened since then. So it's hard to know where to start. I grew up in San Diego. I come from a family of doctors. So, in my family, what I do is vaguely disreputable compared to helping people in a more direct way. But ever since I was a kid, I love computers. I love programming computers. I was, if you have a stereotype in your mind of someone who spent too much time in their parents' basement on a computer instead of going outside and having more wholesome activities, I was really that cliche. And I was really fortunate because I came of age at a time when technology was extremely self-discoverable. So you could, just take computers apart. You could learn how to program them. There wasn't the kind of barriers to that we see now. And so I thought I would be a computer programmer my whole life. And it just so happens that I got drawn into entrepreneurship during the dot-com bubble. I was in college at that time, and everyone was dropping out to start a startup. That was like a thing to do. And to me, it was just a way to build software products and get them to market faster than having to go apprentice myself at a big company. And so I kind of got bitten by the entrepreneurial bug in an unusual way. I had no idea what I was doing. My initial startup was a total disaster. I got to kind of ride the highs and the lows of the dot-com bubble and crash. But that put the idea in my mind that was something that I could do, with my career. So I came out to Silicon Valley and had a very conventional Silicon Valley type career path here, where I was, joined a startup that was also a big failure. And then, some of us who were refugees from that startup started another startup, and that was a success. And so I was kind of on this very, for the Valley anyway, a very conventional technical, leadership tech co-founder kind of path, eventually, becoming a CEO. And then there was this tiny problem, which was that I wound up asking very unpleasant questions about why we did things a certain way in startups. I wanted to understand not just the what, but the why. And so I was trying to understand how to make startups more effective, how to be a better leader in startups myself. And what I found was that at that time, there actually wasn't that much good material written about like the philosophy of how you build a long-term enterprise starting as a startup. business advice and management books were very segmented. Like, here's what you do. Here's, if you're running a multinational company, here's what you should do. If you want to do the good to great thing, or you want this kind of leader or that kind of manager. And there actually wasn't even that much written about entrepreneurship apart from small business and the kind of like tech enabled hyper growth ethos of Silicon Valley. There was not a lot about that. So like what we consider to be very basic questions, like philosophically speaking, about should you listen to customers or trust your own vision? Should you release your product sooner or, when it's more buggy, or later when it's more perfect, quote unquote? Like, these very basic questions were not answered to my satisfaction. And anyway, to make a long story short, I started writing about this concept that I eventually called lean startup. And then that took over my life. So that's kind of how I got here. Like, I was kind of thrust into the spotlight and given the opportunity to learn how business works in a really deep way, because lean startup became a whole movement for change. And I got invited to work with companies of every conceivable size. So if you pick an industry and an order of magnitude of number of employees, from two founders in a garage up to a big multinational, like basically any industry, any combination of those factors you can name, I've had the chance to work with companies of that type and see them try to apply these ideas about innovation, about a more humane form of management, put them into practice. And I can tell you all about it. So that's kind of how I came to prominence and have been given the incredible opportunities that I get to pursue every day now.
I think that's such a fascinating journey to get to for your background. And I think you've even started to set up your next project, the long-term stock exchange, in there, because you talked about wanting to address how to build a long-term enterprise. But your current project is the long-term stock exchange. And I'm wondering if you could share a little about the origins of that and what it is with the community.
Sure. Yeah. So, like building something that you can be proud of, that is like, startups tend to consume your life when they succeed. Like, we spend a lot of time talking about, like, the problem with startups is that they can fail. And that's true. Like, that is a very painful part of it. Believe me, I have my share of failures, but it's actually much worse when they succeed, because, they become a significant part of your life for years or even decades. And many of what are called exits in the startup world are actually really depressing. Like, it's a classic case where, like, a company gets acquired by a big public company. You take your company public, it loses its soul, it becomes a force for evil in the world. The founders get kicked out, or that, it's like all these stories floating around about how basically being successful as an entrepreneur, yes, you can make a lot of money, but can also basically ruin your life. And I know a lot of people who feel that way. They basically sold their baby for money. It's actually a very painful thing to watch. And we've all seen it. I mean, how many products have you personally been the consumer of, where when they went public or they got acquired by a public company, that they were end of life or they got significantly worse? It's actually a very common problem. So I was always writing in the beginning saying, look, we need to not just like build a venture-backed company and flip it for a quick score. Like, that shouldn't be our ethos. Our ethos should be building sustainable, long-lasting institutions, like Toyota. I used to talk a lot about Toyota production system. The lean startup comes from lean manufacturing. And so that was a big inspiration for me. And anyone who studied the Toyota production system, or that kind of era of management breakthroughs, the books always come back to this philosophy of long-term thinking as a primary enabling technology, basically, of the system. And so I started to incorporate that into my writing and speaking. But there was this conflict, because on the one hand, I'm telling people to build the next Toyota, be more sustainable. And on the other hand, I'm enmeshed in a community where our goal is to build venture-backed companies and take them public. And I used to get the question all the time at my workshops and stuff, but hold on, isn't the public markets the most short-term environment on the planet? Why would you take a long-term company public? And I didn't know the answer to that question. That wasn't really my area of research. I was like, that's not really my business. I was trying to hand wave my way away from having to answer that question. But just like with the original questions that drove me into lean startup, it's a question that wouldn't leave me alone. And I just couldn't find a satisfactory answer. Why is it that the corporate governance and capital market structures that we have today, why are they the way that they are? And how come when you talk to people who are successful in those structures, you only ever hear them say that so-and-so, they'll have someone they hold up as an example of success. So-and-so was able to think long-term in spite of our market structure. You never hear anybody say because of the support of our capital market system, they were able to think long-term. And that just seems strange to me. I thought that seems odd. And I was really baffled, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand it. And to make a long story short, I eventually came to this conclusion that although we who build companies, like I was spending a lot of time at this time of my life working not just with founders in Silicon Valley, but I was invited to work with big multinationals and do corporate transformation. And so I was working with boards, CEOs, investors, but also middle managers. I walked the factory floor. I learned how to make appliances and jet engines and all kinds of stuff. And pretty much at any level of the company, if you ask people like what are the top issues afflicting the company today, top three is almost always short-term thinking, short-sightedness on the part of management is like clear repeat offender. And if you ask people why, everyone says the same thing. They say, well, that's just how Wall Street, that's just how it is. Wall Street wants it that way. But that never, ever made sense to me. I said, wait a minute, you're telling me that the investors in companies want them to lose money? Because if your research is really clear, anyone who's ever studied this problem for 5 minutes knows that if you build companies to serve customers and your other stakeholders well over the long term, you will make more money, you will be more profitable. And in fact, if you really think about what does it mean, what does the word profit even mean? Like if your goal is just to make money fast, just do a Ponzi scheme. Right? Like, why not just do a pure fraud, right? So you're like, oh, no, I don't want to do a Ponzi scheme. I want to be profitable. What's wrong? The problem with the Ponzi scheme or, an extractive industry that causes massive negative externalities or something that is fundamentally a fraud. Like the issue with all of these so-called profitable businesses is actually that if you account properly, they're not profitable. They're just borrowing from liabilities that they've created into the future. And, with a Ponzi scheme, you can keep that going a long time. And we see that with the petrocarbon industry and lots of other industries where like you can keep it going, but eventually those bills come due. Is that even really profitable? So I was kind of had a very different view. My view is that it's only profitable if you can sustainably serve customers and your other stakeholders. And the research shows that that's the right thing to do. So I thought, gosh, if this is really true, if there really are investors out there that are pressuring companies to lose money, that's self-defeating. So we ought to find an institution. This like occurred to me in a flash of insight when I was working on my manuscript for the Lean Startup. I can't explain why. I was on an airplane, I used to carry, I was like the worst traveler ever to sit next to on an airplane because I'd be sitting in my little seat and I'd have my stack of books, all my research. I had a heavy suitcase of books that travel with me. I'm going through my books and, taking notes and writing my manuscript. And I was like, wait a second, what we need is an institution that can bring long-term oriented investors. There must be some investors who genuinely have a long-term return profile that they're looking for, and long-term oriented companies together for mutual benefit. We would all make more money if we did that. And I'm like, gosh, what's an institution that can regulate the behavior of managers and investors at the same time? It's not a city government, it's not a this, it's not a that. And it popped in my head, like, oh, that sounds like a stock exchange. We should build a long-term stock exchange, or LTSE. I wrote it in my book, and I thought that was the end of it. That was 10 years ago now. And that's an idea that just over the years would not leave me alone. And I eventually felt like, well, I at least need to give it a shot to see if it's possible to build. And so 5 or 6 years ago, started putting a team together, raised money for the first time in 2016. We got SEC approval to operate the exchange in 2019. We began trading stocks, our trading platform under the national market system in 2020 during the pandemic. And we actually just announced last week that we expect our first 2 listings on the platform this year. So it's been a very long-term project in itself, but we're starting to see some exciting developments with it.
It is incredibly exciting, and you've come a long way in a short period of time. I think you're being a little humble right now. Do you want to share who the first 2 companies are that are going to be listed that was just announced this week?
Yes. This is, you can read in the Wall Street Journal, Asana and Twilio, both public companies, have agreed to add what's called the dual listing on LTSE. So those will be our first. The listings are planned for August 26th.
Congratulations. I'm sure there's a story behind that that we would love to hear, perhaps after we go through what the mechanics of the exchange are. But it really is a boost of confidence and a sign of confidence in what the long-term stock exchange is to get those kinds of companies to be the first to list. So congrats.
Yeah, thank you. We're really honored. These are the highest caliber companies you could ever hope for. So yeah, we think that's it's a pretty cool thing.
So what are the mechanics for how the long-term stock exchange works? What do companies actually do if they want to be listed there?
Yeah, so this is the hard part with reform in this area. On the one hand, we need to have different corporate governance standards for those companies that are actually trying to build something long-term. And on the other hand, the regulatory framework of our capital markets requires that companies' stock be fully liquid. So if your goal is to stop trading or to make trading slow it down, like to push back on the relentless trend of trading, then there's not really that much that you can do. The challenge is, how do you bake long-term corporate governance into a company while also making the stock fully liquid so that they still qualify as a public company in the US system, excuse me. So that took years of intellectual work, multi-stakeholder, multilateral negotiating and compromising, as an ambassador, but also work with the regulators to really figure out, like, how do we make this work? And we came across what I think is a real breakthrough, what we call principles-based listing standards. So let me break that down. First of all, for those who don't know what stock exchanges are or how they work, just a very brief, very, very brief primer on the history of stock exchanges. Today, we've become so postmodern in our economy that we think about things totally the way, in a way that our grandparents would find totally backwards. Like, I don't know if you guys noticed, we had that whole GameStop trading controversy a few months ago. Congress had hearings into what was going on. Anyone notice that the only person not invited to the hearing was the CEO of GameStop? Because like the fact that they make things and they have employees and stuff, like, what does that have to do with anything? Like, who cares? So like, we have come to see exchanges as basically all about liquidity and trading. And I was just doing an AMA, answering questions about our launch last week, and I was astonished how many people said, I don't see the point of this. Exchanges are just for trading. So what's the point of corporate governance in an exchange? And I was like, wow, what an ahistorical view. Exchanges have always, through history, played a dual role and used to be seen as co-equal roles. In fact, originally, it might even say that the corporate governance role was seen as more important. They are standard setters. The listing standards of an exchange define what is the appropriate corporate governance for a public company, and always has. So what we have done is we're trying to harken back to that older idea that corporate governance should be at the heart of the so-called self-regulatory organizations, SROs, of which exchanges are an example. So we have embodied in our listing standards 5 principles of corporate behavior that we think are key. And actually, I'm not going to enumerate the principles because, I mean, it doesn't even matter what they are. The key is that for each principle, the company is required to develop and publish a policy, an operational policy that shows how it is committed to that principle. So on the one hand, it's not a one-size-fits-all check-the-box exercise, like a lot of these reforms have tried to be over the years. It's very hard to find a one-size-fits-all box because the issue, depending on what industry you're in, the issues are very, very different. The stakeholders you serve are very, very different. And frankly, the level of corporate power different companies have to pursue their purpose is also like very different. And I think we got to acknowledge that. That's a reality. But you can't just say like, well, I'm committed to being multi-stakeholder. I'm committed to being long-term. Like those pledges don't mean anything, because they're not necessarily backed up by action. So we think we found the best of both worlds. Companies have to make very concrete pledges. We act as the certifying authority, to prevent them from publishing pablum or policies that are not real. And then ultimately, the market can decide which companies are sincerely committed to these principles and which ones are not. So it's not just a pledge. It's actually a binding promise to operate the company in a certain way. And because of the way that the mechanics of exchanges work, they're able to revise them once a year. So it's also a more flexible setup where we think over time, as this is an emerging area, the best practices are not yet defined. So as new best practices emerge, we'll be able to incorporate more and more of those reforms into the corporate governance of the listed companies.
So if these are principles for companies to follow in order to get listed, it also sounds like these are things that companies that are private and don't have any intention of going public could adopt, or that they could start to adopt even before they are listed on the LTSE.
Yes,
Right?
exactly. One of our recently announced listed companies, when they were giving their interview to the Wall Street Journal, they mentioned that they had actually set up the company with this intention while they were still private, which is definitely the savvy thing to do. I actually have, I have it on my other desk. I actually have a deck of cards that I used to travel around with. But pre-COVID, when I would meet with CEOs and sit with them in private, I actually had a deck of cards printed because there's so many specific things that companies can do while still private, or even if they intend to be private indefinitely, that protect them from these forces that they don't do, because it always feels too early. And I keep hearing from people, it's too early to do this, it's too early to worry about. And my experience is that basically it's literally too early until the very day that it's too late. It never passes through the intermediate day of, oh, today is the day, it's a good time. And the forces that be, the vendors and just the many people who profit by these companies do a really good job of creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt about ever adopting any kind of reform. And so generally corporate governance is more conservative than is appropriate. So yeah, I think so when I used to go with the cards, and the cards are color coded by stage, by principle, so that we could actually get into like, okay, specifically, like if someone says, I want to really, we call it institutionalizing your intentions. If I want to be sure that this institution that I am building will be a force for good in the world long after I'm dead, why should the next CEO, the next CFO, the next board, why should they have anything to like, why should they care what your intention was in founding the company? Why should they stay true to your purpose? And there's several books that have been written that just of case studies of hundreds and hundreds of companies, beautiful, enlightened, mission-driven, conscious companies where everything fell apart because the appropriate protections were not in place. So yeah, I hope this is something that CEOs will take more seriously in the years to come.
So we're already starting to get some questions, and I actually wanted to ask this as well. But Susie Sosa from Verb asked if you can elaborate on the kinds of things that are in the deck of cards. And you mentioned that you have recommendations for different stages. So let's see if you have these memorized. What would be an example of one of the best practices for an early stage company, perhaps?
Sure. I'll give you some easy ones, and then maybe I'll throw a hard one in there just for kicks. And yeah, we need to find a venue for this. We need to do like a workshop or publish. I don't know what to do. I've become like a curator of these arcane corporate governance ideas over the years. And it's like, I have nowhere to display my collection because until 5 minutes ago, nobody was even interested in this topic. It's become like zoomed into prominence and interest all of a sudden, which is great. Here's an easy one. So even a B Corp or a public benefit corp or just a regular C Corp has a board of directors. Most American companies are headquartered for legal reasons in Delaware. So under Delaware law, you have a board of directors. Their board members have what's called a fiduciary obligation to the company and its shareholders. And this is widely interpreted in many circles by saying that they should really, their obligation is to maximize shareholder value. And if you're lucky, in your public benefit corp and you have enlightened directors, they'll say, well, no, it's not just maximizing shareholder value, but it's also the value to other stakeholders. But if you get really right down to it, if someone comes to you and says, I will pay you, what's the company worth? X dollars a share. I will pay you X plus $1 a share to acquire this company so as to shut it down or to subvert its purpose. Even if you're a multi-stakeholder and you say, well, no, but it's also really valuable to our customers. You're like, great, well then tell me what it's worth to your customers. I'll pay X plus 1 to them. You're like, no, but it's also really valuable to the environment. Like if someone like under the Delaware law, under the kind of common interpretation of it, if they could build a checklist of all the things that you're supposed to care about and they could make it 1 cent more valuable in the short term, you have this obligation to say yes. But if you talk to most like purpose-driven companies, this is ridiculous. The purpose of the corporation is to serve this out. So if Philip Morris wants to buy it and turn it into something horrible, there's no price at which you would be willing to do that. And investors who have an understanding of what creates value in this world ought to be on board with that. So a very simple solution to this problem is what's called a board mission pledge. You can change the charter of the nominating committee of the board simply to say that in order for someone to get onto your board, it's a matter of your corporate charter, they have to sign a pledge that they're going to pledge themselves to the purpose of the corporation. That's it. And they're going to therefore restrain their own latitude under Delaware law to do this. I have never met a CEO who doesn't think this is a great idea. And yet it's almost never done, because if you go ask your lawyers about it, they'll say, it's a great idea, but why do it right now? If you ask your investors, I often try to get this put into Series A term sheets. And the investors will be like, listen, we completely agree with this. We think it's great, but you don't need this now. It's a lot of extra complexity around. We can always do it later. And then it's too late. It's always too early until it's too late. But if you read books about, kind of famous entrepreneurs who've had this happen to them, like it's actually a common trope that you like have the entrepreneur interviewed on their deathbed, talking about the regrets they had in their life. Forget business, in their life. They're like, why did I stack my board with these big luminary people and didn't make them pledge themselves to the purpose? And it's pretty sad. So that's an easy one. That's one that's like so easy. You could have your lawyer do this today, in 5 minutes. No, it's not hard to do. Just people have to actually like have the willingness to do it. Now, it might provoke a conversation with some of your board members and investors about, is this really necessary? And I think the people who have the strongest objections to these ideas, it's very revealing about what kind of stakeholder they actually are. So maybe even if you don't implement it, just talking about it might reveal some things you might like to know as CEO. Let me throw a harder one in there. So that's an easy one. That's like table stakes to me. But let's talk about the idea of a corporation as like a nation state unto itself. The scale of operations of the corporations we run today, just in terms of their global impact, is really unprecedented in history. And especially if you look at the ratio of kind of employees of the company officially on the books to human beings who are otherwise implicated in the ecosystem in some other way. So we now have, by historical standards, relatively small groups of people creating global, multinational, worldwide impacts, thanks to the power, not just of technology, but global supply chains and the globalized regulatory environment, et cetera. So who are the citizens of this republic, if you will? Who should benefit from the economic returns that are created by these companies? One of the hot ideas in political science is what's called a social wealth fund, basically a sovereign wealth fund, but is designed to pay social dividends to the citizens of a polity. You see some kind of prototypical examples like the Alaska Permanent Fund, if anyone's ever studied that. Why not do that at the corporate level, especially for tech platforms that have tons and tons of non-employee stakeholders? Think about Uber drivers or Airbnb hosts. These are people whose labor, and not just labor, but their human well-being is essential to the success of the company. And yet the economic returns generally accrue only to equity holders, which by law, those people are prohibited from being while the company is still private. So how about when the company is not worth that much? Don't wait till later, but when it's not worth that much, why don't we set aside some of the equity of this company and turn that into a sovereign wealth fund to benefit the many stakeholders of the corporation? And don't just do like a corporate philanthropy, kind of PR thing, but really bring it into the governance of the corporation. Airbnb recently announced this work that we had worked on for years to get this done. They have now $1 billion set aside in an endowment for the hosts of Airbnb. And that is like a Christmas tree upon which amazing other kinds of governance stuff can be hung, because then you can start to say, well, now we need to make sure that we have representation at the board level. So maybe the people who oversee that foundation or endowment have some ability to influence what's happening at the board level. You could imagine even going further than this and taking the revenues of the company and having some of them flow into the endowment. You could imagine the endowment not just being holding the company stock, but really becoming almost like a multifamily office that invests in other related opportunities. And if you want to get really intense about it, the founders of all these companies make people fabulously wealthy beyond anyone's imagining. And so every one of these companies, if you think about it in a broader way, the ecosystem around the company is full of wealthy people with their own family office pursuing all kinds of philanthropic, but more importantly, investment opportunities that the people who generated the wealth are barred from participating in. So why not combine? Why not have the founder's personal family office and the endowment be one and the same, so that the incredible investment opportunities offered to the elites who run these companies are also made available to the beneficiaries who created the wealth in the first place? So yeah, that's, each of these is just one card in the deck. So we could do this all day, but you get the idea.
And as one follow-up, I think those are great practices, but Susie's also curious how she can get her hands on a deck of cards herself. How can people actually access that?
Someone just said, I'm just Eric at ltse.com. We have not published a deck. I can't mail it to you, but happy to talk about some of the stuff. We run a workshop from time to time. It's kind of like everything you want to know about, getting ready, generally for companies that are thinking about going public in the future. But it's basically the governance and finance side of this. So happy to figure out the right way to get that information out. Yeah, apologies if we haven't published anything yet.
Well, it sounds like there might be demand for it, so something to keep in mind.
All right. I'll have to make at least one other copy.
Exactly. And we're starting to get more questions. Want to turn it over to the audience, but the last question I have for you is, what's on the horizon that's next with the long-term stock exchange? What are you most excited about, and what are going to be the biggest challenges you think going forward?
So I've never worked on a project like this before, where the number one most difficult thing about the LTSE from a company building perspective is that people believe that what we are doing is impossible. So even now, people, every time we have a milestone that passes where we say, look, we've accomplished X, people very regularly tell me that we didn't really accomplish X. It's not true. So like when we first started trading stocks, I had the hardest time convincing anybody that we actually were trading stocks. And like, this is a matter of public record. It's a highly regulated financial utility. Like, it's not like a secret. It's just I eventually have come to see that this is a cognitive dissonance issue. We have developed a kind of learned helplessness in elite circles in our society about whether the institutions that govern our daily civic lives can be reformed for the better or not. It's like a deep weariness and cynicism that I think is one of the most, it is a personality trait that needs to be expunged from the body politic, in my humble opinion. It's terrible, because nothing serves the forces of the status quo better than the idea that there is no hope, nothing can be done. So I don't accept that. So mostly what we have to do with LTSE is just get the word out that change is possible. Like, even putting aside, like, is our change the right one? Or, is there a better, maybe someone will come along with a better idea. But honestly, like, this fight is for the possibility that it can be changed. The Nicene Nasdaq duopoly, like, has been firmly established and entrenched since the creation of Nasdaq in the 70s. We're talking about 50 solid years of absolute dominance. So much so that, like, I've been told hundreds of times, thousands of times, that nobody could crack that duopoly. No one would ever be able to get a new company to list. It's like, it's impossible. So, now we're in the post-impossible period. But it was also impossible for us to get the LTC even approved by the regulators. It was considered impossible for us to get trading. Like, everything we've accomplished has been deemed impossible. So our main challenge now is, okay, we've taken away the excuse that it's impossible. So now, going back to all these companies where it's too early until it's too late, the hardest challenge we have, just from a company building point of view, is getting considered. Here's a funny thing I'll tell you. I've pitched LTSE, because before we were trading stocks, we weren't legally allowed to pitch companies like to list on the exchange. So this is the first crop of companies that actually were legally allowed to say yes. But I've been having informational meetings with companies for a decade now about this idea. The whole time, I've never had a company say no. Not even once. I never gotten the call from a company like, listen, we considered it, we looked at it, and we decided not to do it. They just stopped calling me back. I have the meeting and they're like, it's too early, they'll call us back when it's time. And then I call back when it's time, and no, and I just don't get my call returned, because I think at some level people know that if you actually go down the rabbit hole of diligence, if you look at the due diligence, you're like, wait a minute. It's a common question. Companies get this question at their employee town hall all the time from employees, like, hey, you say we're long-term, like 5 minutes, 5 times a day. So are we doing this or what? And, it's a very uncomfortable question for CEOs, for boards, for managers. Like, you're like, what is our excuse exactly? So we need to get considered. That's like our whole, we're not trying to, we don't even really sell this. Like, this is not something to be sold. We just want to be considered. We've had a lot of companies where we've helped them develop their corporate governance and do the things that we recommend without ever becoming our customer. We really don't care about that. We ourselves are a mission-driven organization. These reforms are the reason we exist, and whether we make money or not is a totally secondary consideration. But getting considered is actually really hard. Now, if you talk to investment bankers and you say, what is the process to go public? They all have a process. So it has like 92 steps, and you do this, then you do this. And one of the steps is to choose what exchange to list on. So I think the next step for us is that when companies have that meeting, every company that has ever gone public has had at least one meeting with NYSE and at least one meeting with NASDAQ. Now they have 50 meetings with SPACs too, but like all kinds of crazy stuff. But like, they at least have one meeting about it. And we're just like, could we get invited to that meeting? That's it. That's all we're asking for. And if you think about it, if people were as actually dismissive of the idea as they say they are, they wouldn't be so afraid of having us come to the meeting. So I actually think the fact that people work so hard to make sure that this doesn't ever get considered, again, considered and say no, I got no complaint. But how do we make sure that it's considered by every company that claims to be purpose or mission driven? That's our next hurdle we got to clear.
Brilliant. So Jennifer Fondreve has a follow-up really to this in my mind, and is wondering, what does success look like for the exchange? Not just your next step, but let's say long-term goal for the long-term stock exchange. What are you really trying to accomplish here? And we'll say mission accomplished when X happens.
It's a great question, Jennifer, and people find my answer really unsatisfying. But I'll just tell you the truth. Here's my honest feeling about this. We as a civilization are on a collision course with physics. And it's not just climate change. we see it in inequality. We see it in the breakdown of our civic institutions. We see it in our like inability to even defend the basics of liberal democracy and agree on facts. I mean, like we have some very severe problems that we are on a collision course with. And this is the engine of much of this dysfunction. There's like a spiritual void or a disease that has gotten embedded into the system that we call capitalism. And people sometimes describe this as profit over people, but that's not even right, because as I said before, I don't even believe the idea that this is about profit. There's actually an anti-profit ideology that is about power and control, that is like it's about the destruction of human beings and the destruction to the things that create value. It is like lurking. It's like the soul of the machine. It's lurking in there. Personally, I think it has its origins. I was reading something recently about when chattel slavery went from kind of a kind of extreme form of indentured servitude to something that actually destroyed people. It has to do with the sugar trade and how backbreaking and horrifying the production of sugar was in the early parts of the slave trade. Like there was this idea that was introduced kind of contemporaneously with many of our organizational forms that saw human beings as a consumable resource, no longer as the agents or the beneficiaries of the system, but simply another raw material to be processed and destroyed. And I don't think we have truly 100% purged that idea from our collective consciousness, or really ever atoned for having entertained it in the past, let alone literally consuming the fruits of that labor even as we speak right now. So I think that the spiritual dimension and the physical dimension of our destruction are deeply linked, and success is about the next generation of companies being the ones to truly step out of this historical context and say, no, a profitable company is one that serves its stakeholders, that has a conscious leadership. I don't have to tell any of you like what it should look like. We know what it looks like. We know it when we see it. That has to become the standard for what capitalism is. Otherwise, we are literally using our consumer purchases, our investment behavior. Like many people's retirement savings are invested in companies that are making the planet unlivable for their retirement. So like this whole thing is self-destroying. We have to stop it. So like I said, this may not be the very best reform, but the first step to making any reforms is to have people believe en masse that reform is possible, and then we can go from there. So that's the goal. That's how we'll know that we succeeded. People then say, well, that's not a very satisfying answer. What about your intermediate milestones? It's like, well, this has taken 10 years just to get to the starting line. I can't tell you how long it will take, to get to any other specific intermediate milestone, and I don't stress that too much. I think ultimately, there's not like, this is not a network effects business in the sense that we have to hit a certain critical mass for it to be viable. We haven't talked about this, but the mechanics of exchanges mean that every stock that we list, including the ones we just announced, are going to be fully liquid even on the first day of their listing. So there's not a barrier to this. It's simply, this whole reform, the fate of our civilization, everything hinges between the ears of an incredibly small number of people. Like there just aren't that many companies in the world. And so if you think about and certainly not that have any kind of employees, once you cut it off, like greater than 10 employees or something like that, we're talking about a very small number of companies. There's only 5,000 public companies listed in the US at all. That's already half what it was 20 years ago. So it's, again, a very small number of people have the leadership burden to lead us out of this mess. And so success is that group of people saying it's time to act in an enlightened way. And so hopefully this is a baby step in that direction.
So I'm noticing a thread from a few different people watching right now, Joe, Susie, and Greg, really asking about the role of investors with this and what kind of changes you're seeing with investors right now, or are you seeing opposition to this really from investors, since you're hearing a lot of positivity from startup leaders and the leaders of companies themselves for this?
Well, I've learned to make a hard distinction between investors and speculators. So like, what does it mean to invest? Like, why is investment important? So if you challenge people and say, why do we have investing? Why do we have stock markets? Why do we allow any of this? As a society, they'll say, well, hold on. Efficient capital allocation is very important. Matchmaking between entrepreneurs and the capital to pursue their dreams is very important. And you're like, okay, that's true. I 100% agree with that. It's called capital formation. When someone gives money to an entrepreneur to make something, that creates real value in the world. And that's just true in a public company. Like if a public company wants to build a factory and they raise money to do so, that creates a lot. That is genuinely investing. And then you say, but most shares that trade hands on an exchange every day, did they get invested in anything? Not really. right? There's what are called secondary shares. I'm not giving it to the company to facilitate the making of something. I bought it from someone who 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 bought it from someone that caused something to be created, right? So there's this chain of causality between what I do today and what actually is the like moral justification for this whole system. Now, people will say, but you can't have, in order for primary shares to be valuable to the investor, for them to earn a return, you have to allow secondary trading. And that's true. That's like the tail that wags the dog. Well, we've now gotten so far away from that idea that that's the tail, that's become the whole dog. This is like we've gone far beyond what our grandparents would recognize as like a sensible and efficient system here. We now have tons of people who make their money primarily by trading the same set of shares over and over and over again and engaging in all kinds of silly financial engineering and latency arbitrage and all this stuff. So there's speculators in the market. Now, there's always been speculators since time immemorial. It's not a problem. I'm not saying speculators are bad. I don't think activists are bad. I'm not saying hedge funds are bad. Those people are not bad. But the system can incentivize more or less capital formation at any given time. And our view is we just want to, and it's changed a lot in the last 20 years, especially weighting, corporate governance power has become dramatically weighted towards short-term actors over long-term actors in a way that I don't think anyone really intended, but makes very little sense. We now have a situation where like most common citizens' retirement savings have been locked out of growth investing for a long time. So we live in a world of what's called secular stagnation. Only the extremely wealthy are able to make decent returns on their money. Does that really make sense? So like, there's a bunch of these policy choices that we make that as long as we don't pretend that there's some kind of like natural phenomenon, that these are choices, we can make different choices. I say that because investors love this, speculators, not so much. And it's not even that speculators are against it. They're just like, what's the point? Like if you read the comments on any of the stories about us, you'll just see hundreds of comments from people who are just like, I don't see what the purpose of this is. Why do I need this? And I'll tell you one story. I was sitting with a quantitative trader, like someone who oversees a quantitative trading firm and someone who oversees a like long only hedge fund. We were having lunch, the three of us, and I'm describing LTSE and talking about it. And the person who ran the long only hedge fund, he's like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And the guy who ran the quantitative was very confused. And the guy who was running the long only hedge fund, he turned to the quantitative guy and said, listen, what's your average holding period on your stocks? And the guy was really proud. He's like, we've gotten it down to 10 minutes. We're trying to get it down even lower. Because remember, for them, holding the stock is a form of liability. So like the dream scenario would be to never own anything, but simply to just gamble in and out as fast as possible. The guy who ran the long only hedge fund said, that's really interesting. This was like, I think we're in midsummer. He's like, yeah, we haven't done any trades yet this year. And the quantitative guy was like, he was like shocked at this trade. He's like, yeah, well, he's like, what are you talking about? What do you do? He's like, well, we bought companies that we like, and we still like them, and we haven't found anything else we want to buy. So there's no reason to sell, no reason to buy. So like, it was like, these are like two completely different people. But here's the fascinating part about it. The quantitative guy's not bad. He's not an evil person. And I asked him to do a little thought experiment for me. I said, listen, I want you to imagine a day in the future where you have engineered a synthetic short against a company and it worked. So you found through financial engineering, you caused their stock price to go down 30% today. And your shorts all you just made a ton of money. And the guy, you can see the grin on his face. He loves this scenario. He's like, oh yeah, this is awesome. So do you realize that the next day, the 10,000 human beings who work at this company are running around like chickens with their heads cut off, changing the company's strategy? And he was like, no, why would they do that? He's like, well, their stock price just went down. They need to make their investors happy. He's like, what? He's like, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. And he literally was like, when I short cattle futures, the cows don't care. Like, why do they care? Like, he couldn't believe it. He's like, wait, you're telling me that there are human beings on the other end of this ticker symbol? What does that have to do with me? And I said, so listen, do you actually play a very important role in corporate governance of this company? Was that your goal? Was that your intention? He was like, no, I hate corporate governance. I was like, I don't want to vote my shares. I don't want anything to do with that. So I was like, listen, so how about a system where people like this guy who you're having lunch with, who's been in the stock for 5 years, how about we have him do the voting and the corporate governance stuff, and you do the things and he was like, this is a great idea. This is a wonderful division of labor. Let me do my thing, you do this. So we call them the tourists and the citizens of the republic. And they both play a vital role, but no one would say that a country should be run by the tourists. Come on.
So we're at time now, unfortunately, but I have to ask, I mean, that was a real conversation that you had, it sounds like.
Yeah, I'm not. I wish I had the creativity to make this kind of stuff up. I've had that conversation 100 times. It's like a trope at this point.
I honestly wish we had more time right now, and I'm going to want to follow up with you about this because there's so much to unpack there. But just want to say Thank you for the work that you're doing, Eric. Thank you for sharing this with the community today and even sharing your email for people to follow up about the deck and anything else with you. Really, just so appreciate your time and everything that you're doing.
Oh, that's very kind. I really appreciate it. And listen, I'm such a believer in what you guys are doing as ECI, and I just think um, we need to make material structural changes, but like only because ultimately at the end of the day, it's the mindset of leaders that determines the outcome, the fates of civilizations. And so to bring that consciousness, to bring that into business, to bring that into the kind of work that everyone in this call is doing every day, I really honor that and really thank all of you, everyone who's making the world a little bit better and doesn't feel like that's like a joke, but is the serious purpose of the work that we do. You have my undying support and appreciation. So thanks, Alex. I really appreciate this chance to have this conversation.
Again, thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you at the next virtual gathering coming up.